In 2012, one woman with no climbing experience at all set out for the highest point on Earth. The Sherpas warned her. She did not listen. So, who was the woman who said she would climb Everest? Shriya Shah was born in Kathmandu, Nepal, right in the shadow of the very mountain that would one day take her life. When she was 9 years old, her father took her on a helicopter ride near the peak, and for the first time she saw it up close. She described that moment later as breathtaking. She said she looked up at that summit, and something in her just decided, one day I will do that. Years later, Shriya had traveled far from home. She worked on cruise ships, moved through India, and eventually settled in Toronto, Canada, after meeting and marrying her husband Bruce, who played piano on the ship. In Toronto, she built a full life. She ran an import business, worked in fashion buying, and even ran briefly as a political candidate. She was the kind of person who threw herself completely into whatever she chose to do. But Everest stayed with her. It never really left. In 2011, she sat down with Bruce and told him she was going to climb it. He thought she had completely lost her mind. Most of the people who knew her agreed. She had never once climbed a mountain in her life, not even a small one. Why did everyone around her think she had lost her mind? The reaction from the people who loved Shriya was almost exactly the same across the board. Shock, then worry, then a quiet but determined attempt to talk her out of it. Her husband Bruce tried everything he had. Her close friend Virginia sat her down and made her case. And every single time Shriya gave the same answer. She was fine. She was going. That was it. And this is the part that is important to understand. Shriya was not careless in the way people usually imagine. She was not someone acting impulsively without thought. She genuinely believed she was capable. That confidence was completely real. Her friends described her as a very driven woman, who believed in herself in a way that most people simply do not. And in most of her life, that drive had worked. It carried her through a career abroad, through marriage, through building something from nothing in a new country. But Everest does not respond to drive the way a career does. The mountain has no interest in how badly you want it. The people around Shriya understood that with complete clarity, even if she could not see it herself. Bruce tried right up until she boarded her flight. He failed, and quietly he accepted that he might never see her again. What did it actually cost her to chase this dream? Climbing Everest is not a hobby. It is one of the most expensive things a human being can choose to do. When Shriya sat down and calculated what she needed, the number landed somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000. That covered the guide company, the climbing permits, the gear, the flights, and the tips for the Sherpas, who would physically help keep her alive on the mountain. She had no sponsors. No one writing a check for her. The fundraising events she organized brought in almost nothing at all. So she did something that tells you everything you need to know about her state of mind. She took out a second mortgage on her house. She borrowed against the roof over her head to pay for the climb. At that point, this was no longer just a dream on a vision board. It was a financial decision that had real consequences either way. Turning back meant losing the money. Going forward meant risking her life. She chose to go forward, and the guide company she hired, Utmost Adventure Trekking, had never successfully guided a single client to the Everest summit before. That fact alone should have been a warning no one acted on. How did she prepare for the most dangerous mountain on Earth? To her credit, Shriya took her preparation seriously. She trained every single day, and she trained hard. Mornings were martial arts. Evenings were cardio and strength work. She put in around 6 hours of physical training daily, which by any honest standard is an enormous commitment. She ran regularly with a 45-pound backpack strapped to her back. She climbed stairs in her 40-story apartment building in Toronto, over and over trying to build the kind of endurance the mountain would demand. Shriya had never climbed a mountain before Everest. Not a training peak in the Alps. Not a moderate climb in the Rockies. She went from standing in a Toronto gym directly to the highest place on Earth. The guides convinced themselves that determination could substitute for experience, that once she got to Nepal and started real training, she would close the gap. But there are things that years of actual mountain climbing teach you that no amount of determination can replicate in a few weeks. Why did the Sherpas say she would not come back? When Shriya arrived at base camp in Nepal, the truth of her situation became visible almost immediately. She was slow, not a little slow. She was noticeably slower than every other climber on the mountain. In training sessions, even going downhill, she fell behind the group by a significant margin. As the weather windows narrowed and the pressure to make a summit attempt built up, the senior Sherpa reached a point where he could no longer stay quiet. He went directly to Shriya and said it plainly. If you walk on this route, you will die. And you will kill us, too. No softening of the message. No careful diplomatic wording. Just the truth as he understood it from decades of experience on that mountain. Shriya heard him. She looked at him. And she told the guides she was going one way or the other. The conversation was over before it started. What was happening on Everest the night she set out? On the evening of May 18, 2012, Shriya left Camp 4 at 7:30 at night. The summit was half a mile straight above her. Even for the most experienced climbers in peak condition, the round trip from Camp 4 takes between 10 and 12 hours. That is already demanding everything a trained human body has. But 2012 was already a terrible year on the mountain. Unusual weather patterns had been triggering avalanches for weeks. A massive wall of ice called a sarak had collapsed and destroyed an entire high-altitude camp, just hours before dozens of climbers were scheduled to arrive there. Russell Bryce, a New Zealander with nearly 4 decades of Everest experience and one of the most respected expedition leaders in the world, had made a decision that stunned the climbing community. He canceled his entire expedition. He told clients who had each paid more than $50,000 that conditions were simply too dangerous to continue. No refunds. The climbers who stayed were now all forced into the same narrow weather window. Hundreds of them. Moving at the same time up the same single rope line on the same narrow route. A German climber photographed that line from below, and the image became one of the most widely shared in Everest history. A human traffic jam on the roof of the world. People queuing at the highest place on Earth, some of them with barely any training at all. How did she actually make it to the top? Through every bottleneck, every wait, every hour of brutal cold, Shriya kept moving forward. She was the slowest person on that line. Everybody knew it. But she did not stop. Step by step through the entire night, her headlamp pointing upward at the dark ridge ahead. She sat down frequently to rest. The air at that altitude is so thin that 2 steps forward and stopping to catch your breath is not weakness. It is simply how humans move at that height. For Shriya, every single meter gained was a fight. At the Hillary Step, a 15-meter, nearly vertical wall of rock and ice just below the summit, the wait was 2 full hours. While standing in that line, the owner of her guide company, Ganesh Shakuri, came back down from the summit and found her. He looked at her oxygen tanks. She had approximately 20 minutes of oxygen left. He told her directly to turn around and go back down. She refused. He handed her one final bottle, the 9th she had used, and then he descended without her. He left his least experienced client behind with 2 Sherpas who had little high-altitude experience themselves. No one physically turned her around. On May 19, 2012, just before 2:30 in the afternoon, Shriya Shah reached the summit of Mount Everest. She had been climbing for 16 hours straight. At that moment, she became the first South Asian Canadian woman to ever stand on top of the world. Why was that summit moment already too late? The photo taken of Shriya at the summit shows someone who looks calm, almost at peace. She does not look like a person in crisis. She spent close to half an hour up there taking in the view she had carried inside her since she was 9 years old. And in that moment, nothing else existed for her. She was on top of the world. Russell Bryce saw the timeline and said 2 things. He called her determination absolutely amazing. And then, In the very next breath, he called it absolutely stupid. Because by every calculation that mattered, she had already crossed the point of no return before she ever stepped onto the summit. She had been climbing for nearly 20 hours. Her oxygen supply was almost entirely gone, and the weather was shifting fast. Winds were accelerating toward hurricane force. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, and the descent from the summit of Everest is by almost every account more dangerous than going up. Your body is finished. Your mind is operating at a fraction of its normal capacity. The same ice and rock that you climbed over on the way up has to be navigated again on legs that can barely hold your weight. Shriya started back down just before 3 in the afternoon. By the time she passed the Hillary step again on her way down, the oxygen that had been given to her there that morning was almost certainly already gone. From the south summit down to the balcony, she was breathing unfiltered air at 8,000 meters. At that altitude, the human body begins to consume itself. What did her final hours on the mountain look like? The 2 Sherpas assigned to Shriya did not give up on her. They stayed. They pushed her with words and physically held her upright as she moved. One Sherpa used a Nepali term that means big sister, calling out to her again and again, trying to keep her moving. Her legs had stopped working the way they should. He described it as though they had gone completely paralyzed beneath her. The 2 guides were essentially carrying a person who weighed as much as they did, while their own bodies were also running out of time. After 10 at night, Shriya stopped moving entirely. She stopped speaking. At approximately 8,400 meters on a narrow, exposed ledge known as the balcony, the 2 Sherpas clipped her harness to the fixed rope so she would not fall, and then made the only decision available to them. They descended. They left her there among the frozen remains of others who had run out of time in that same place over the decades. A different Sherpa heading upward later that night saw the red and white of a Canadian flag on a down suit lying on the snow. He recognized her. He called to her 4 times using the Nepali word for big sister. She made a sound, not a word, just a sound, and then she was still. Russell Bryce said it another way. He said Everest had become so commercially successful over the years that people began to treat a summit as if it were nearly automatic, as if paying the fee was the same as reaching the top. It was never automatic. Not for a single person who ever set foot on that mountain. Shriya believed in herself with everything she had, and the mountain simply did not care. Shriya Shah reached the summit she had dreamed of since childhood. She proved something painful. Everest does not reward determination alone. It demands experience, respect, and it always collects what it is owed.